For the second Grayscale demo, we're going to be doing a slightly more challenging piece. We're using a clothed figure for reference, which will add some complexity to the painting and also an additional layer of value control that we'll have to apply. With the lesson itself, and with our first demo, we just had a figure against a background, so the value ranges we had to keep separate were the figure's lights and shadows and the background. Adding another material to the scene adds another selection of values that we'll have to control and keep separated. The values of the skin, both its lights and shadows, and the values of the dress, both their lights and shadows, as well as the background to frame all of them. We'll get to how this is handled later, but for now we're going to start off with a figure sketch, just like before. Even if the figure is clothed, I find it helpful to try and draw the figure itself underneath first. This will help me to establish why the fabric is folding the way it does, and it also allows me to be sure that my gesture and proportions are correct before hiding the figure underneath any kind of clothing. A lot of beginners run into an issue where they start by drawing the clothing over the figure first and don't properly account for the proportions underneath, which can often result in figures that have proportional or gesture problems. So even if you don't take your figure to the level that I'm drawing here, I would recommend drawing your figure first and then adding clothes to it later. The more you practice figure drawing and understand forms and anatomy, the easier this will become. You can see, as before, I'm using a mixture of drawing, erasing, and using free transform to adjust my pose and proportions as needed. I'm also being a little bit more loose in how I'm following the reference. I've made some slight adjustments to the pose, and most notably have adjusted the gesture of the hands. This is a purely personal preference. I just started sketching out the hands, and these hands emerged naturally. They felt a little bit more elegant to me, and after all, this is a painting, not a copy of a photograph, so any changes you feel improve the piece or make it more your own, feel free to explore a bit and experiment. I'm also going to be sure to sketch in the surface that she's sitting on, as that will affect her gravity as well as the cloth draping off of that surface. Once I'm happy with the figure underneath, I'm going to start adding in the fabric. Fabric is a fairly complex topic, and we won't get too in-depth with how to draw it here. The most important part of drawing fabric is almost treating it like a gesture drawing when you're working on a figure. Try to identify the major rhythms first, make them flow pleasantly into each other, and then you can add smaller rhythms and shapes that reinforce those larger rhythms. These are the major rhythms that I see on this particular reference, and you can see that I've tried to make all of my smaller folds flow seamlessly with these larger rhythms. Just because the folds appear one way in the reference doesn't necessarily mean that that's the best design or a perfectly aesthetically pleasing collection of folds. While nature is beautiful and very helpful when we're trying to draw, it can also be random and chaotic, and sometimes you'll want to edit the design that nature provides you in order to get a more aesthetically appealing piece. So I'm going to be using the folds of the fabric from the reference as a starting point to try and understand how this dress is draping across the figure, but you can see in this drawing process and throughout the painting process as well that I'm simplifying some of the folds and editing some of their flows and directions to try and get a nice rhythm. I'm never trying to copy the reference perfectly, I'm trying to make something that looks pleasing on the canvas. Overall, I'll be keeping this drawing stage fairly gestural, and as long as my proportions are correct, I can resolve a lot of my smaller details in the painting. I personally like to keep my drawings a little bit loose, as that allows me opportunity to make discoveries in the painting. If I solve all my problems in the drawing, then the painting can become a little bit too paint by numbers for me, and it loses a bit of the joy and also the freshness that comes from making decisions while painting. So I want my drawing to be accurate enough that I'm not making any major mistakes in the painting, but not so clean and perfect that I don't have any liberty to make different decisions or change things or adjust elements on the fly. Once I've refined the figure, I'm going to go ahead and quickly sketch in some of the fabric in the background. I'm not going to define this background fabric super clearly, as I want it to be more soft-edged and implied than the fabric on the figure. Just like when rendering muscles on the figure, I want to choose where the levels of highest information will be in my painting, and in this case, I want the amount of information to increase as it gets closer and closer to this figure's face. So leaving the background a little more vague will create a clearer focal point around the portrait. Once I'm happy with my drawing, I'm going to go ahead and tone the canvas. Like I mentioned before, I have a more complicated value structure that I have to set up here. I have to separate the figure from the cloth and the figure from the background, and also keep the figure's shadows separated from the cloth's highlights. Overall, the fabric is a darker local value than the skin, so I'm going to start by just separating my piece into 3 flat values, my lightest value being the skin, a mid-tone value for the fabric, and a darker value for the background. I also use a soft brush here to add a bit of fall-off light, just to emphasize that my light is coming from above in my flat value breakdown, allowing me to further reinforce that the portrait is the focal point of this painting. Once I've blocked in my flat values, I'm going to start blocking in my shadow shapes, just like before. The difference here being that I want to be sure that the shadows of my skin stay light enough that they still feel separate from the values of the fabric. I then eyedrop the fabric's local value and select a value slightly darker than that to add in the shadows. You might also notice that I'm using the dual-edged brush to create these shadow patterns. This is very helpful for me as I can choose the direction of my brush stroke in order to create either a hard or a soft edge, which allows me to seamlessly switch between painting soft-edged form shadows or hard-edged cast shadows as needed, without having to change my brush. I don't want to get too heavy into any of the details of the fabric at this point. I'm just trying to establish the big picture of the painting. So just like with the drawing, I want to establish the major rhythms of the shadows of the fabric, and then leave some of the smaller details to be discovered once I start rendering. Once I'm happy with my shadow values, it's time to start painting. I almost always like to start with the portrait, no matter what kind of task I'm working on, as I feel like if you can really nail the portrait, then the rest of the painting is pretty easy to come together. I have a fairly solid drawing to work over top of, though there are some adjustments I make to the proportions as we go on, and that's fine with me. Like I said before, I like the painting to be a process of discovery, so even if my drawing is fairly accurate, there will still be opportunities to change things as I paint and render. For the actual rendering of this piece, I'm going to be using almost exclusively a soft round airbrush. This is a great tool for creating very clean and smoothly rendered images, and it's actually quite easy to get a fairly strong amount of edge control with this brush, as the smaller you make the brush, the harder the edge becomes, simply due to the nature of how many pixels it has between the center of the brush and the soft edge fading away. So anytime I need a hard edge, you can see that I'm shrinking the brush size down substantially, and anytime I need a soft edge, I increase the brush size and paint more gently. I feel like the soft brush can be a great place to start with your rendering. Establish your major forms, and then you can always add more texture later with different, more interesting brushes. For this painting, I'm going to go for a smoother, high-rendered, classical-looking approach, and for me, the soft brush is a perfect way to achieve that. As I'm rendering the forms of the face, I'm trying to be cautious to not darken my midtones too much. If those midtones start to get too dark, not only will they become muddy and overlap with the shadows of the skin, but they will also start to overlap with the values of the dress. It's very important to me to keep these regions of values separated, so it's even more important than before that I keep my midtones pretty subtle and restrain the ranges of values between each different material in the scene. I often find myself taking the portrait to only about 80% of finish in this first pass. I like to start with the portrait as it kind of sets the stage for the rest of the painting, but it's easy to miss problems and details when you've been staring at one thing for too long. So I find if I try to take my portrait all the way to completion in one sitting, I often end up with some proportional problems. Rather than try to finish it all at once, I try to get it pretty far along and then move on to other things. Inevitably, I will either take a break or come back to it the next day, and it'll be much easier for me to spot issues with the portrait after taking a bit of a break from the piece. Just like the first demo, I'm looking for opportunities to simplify and stylize some of the shapes of the anatomy. I still want it to feel realistic, but if I notice an area where I think adjusting the shape will be more appealing, then I'm going to do that, as I'm not trying to copy the reference one for one. In terms of how you progress with your painting, it's somewhat up to you how you like to approach this. For me, I kind of like to paint one thing at a time, so you'll see that I start by purely rendering the skin across the entire figure. Then once I'm done with that, I can start painting the fabric around it. This isn't a right or wrong way to paint, it's simply a matter of preference and how you enjoy working. The reason I'm choosing to paint the figure before I paint the dress is that the figure will be more challenging, and I usually find if I can get the more difficult aspects of a painting out of the way first, then I can really just focus and have a good time painting all the easier and more fun things later on. As I move into painting the anatomy and the hands, I'm again deviating a little bit from the reference, partially because I've changed the gesture of the hands, but partly because I'm looking for ways to simplify and stylize some of these forms to create something that feels a little bit more intentionally painted. And if these decisions seem like a bit of a mystery to you, don't worry about it just yet. We're going to talk a lot about how light and form and values interact later on, and the more confident you get with your drawing skills and your understanding of light and form, the easier it will become to make these kinds of changes. For now, just rely on your reference as much as you need to, take creative liberties where you feel they're necessary, and if they don't work out, just paint over that area and try again. As I render this arm that's gently touching her chest, I'm also adding in sort of a third sublayer to my value structure. I want to describe the perspective of her pose with rendering as much as I do with drawing. So because her entire hand is generally facing the light source more than either section of her arm, I'm trying to be sure that none of the lighter values of my hand bleed into the forearm below. I still want the forearm to overall be a lighter shape than the fabric in the background, but I want the forearm to have slightly darker values than the hand itself. This will emphasize that the forearm is facing a different direction in this space and make the figure seem more realistic and more properly lit. Now that I've painted in the figure, I'm going to start working on the fabric. Just like in the drawing stage, I find that I want to simplify and stylize a lot of things about this fabric. I'm going to be looking at the reference to understand the rhythms of the fabric and see where the major folds will be, but I'm not going to copy any of these specific folds exactly. I would much rather rely on the gesture that I established with my drawing and continue to reinforce that gesture with smaller shapes in the painting, rather than try to copy something directly from the photo. In addition to stylizing some of the shapes, I'm also looking for which folds I don't even need to paint at all. For instance, as her torso moves downwards towards the hips, the reference has a lot of really small folds right next to the hand that I feel are calling more attention than they need to. Rather than copy those exactly, I've decided to just omit those folds completely, and keep some of the larger folds above to imply that that's happening as it continues downwards, sort of letting the belly itself fade away into the shadows behind it. I feel like this creates more focus around the hand and removes a lot of unnecessary detail that wasn't really contributing much to the image. One of the most important things with fabric is simply edge control. If you pay very close attention to your reference, you can see spots where a fold will start with a soft edge, gradually roll into shadow, and then usually be met with a hard edge as it transitions direction to the next plane. Keeping in mind your edges as you paint fabric is one of the best ways to make your folds look realistic and natural. And don't worry, we'll be discussing a lot about edge control as well in part 2 of this course. Another important thing to look for in fabric is separating major different plane shifts. Just like the raised forearm and hand, where the forearm is generally darker than the hand, I want to be sure I reinforce my larger planes by restraining my value ranges between lighter and darker areas. For example, if you look at the fabric over her chest, The midtones there are lighter than any of the midtones that wrap around her stomach. This helps reinforce that a major plane change is happening where her chest is generally facing more upwards, and the rest of her torso is generally facing more forwards or downwards. As I continue to render the fabric, my soft brush is really coming in handy. That trick where making it smaller makes the edge harder and making it bigger makes the edge softer is really useful for painting fabric, as I can get a huge variety in my edges without having to switch between a bunch of different brushes. You could also use a dual-edged brush to achieve a similar effect, but since I'm going for a very smooth render without a lot of visible brush strokes, I find the soft brush is more appropriate for this particular style. Just like with the skin, I'm trying to be very careful with the midtones of the fabric. I don't want any of the midtones to get too dark and start appearing like shadows. Although the fabric is pretty complicated and has a lot of different folds, there's only a handful of spots where it truly descends into actual shadow, and a lot of the other folds are just very subtle variations of midtones. One of the most important things you can ever possibly do for making your paintings feel like they're truly lit is to keep your light value ranges and your shadow value ranges separated from each other. This is true of skin and fabric and everything else you may ever want to paint. There will always be some variations and exceptions to this rule, as light is very complicated, and depending on your environment, there can be a lot of factors that affect the values of these different things. But you should always be looking for ways to keep that clear separation as much as possible to truly capture the effect of light. Continuing to move downwards on the painting, I'm going to start working on her feet. Again, I want to maintain my clear separation of values here, keeping it distinct from the fabric or the background behind. And I'm also going to paint these a little bit more loosely. As I'm traveling further and further away from the focal point, I want to be a little less rendered, a little bit more painterly, and a little bit more soft-edged. So I want to paint these feet just enough that they appear correct, but not render them so much that they start competing with the hands or the face. I'm also looking for any areas where I can melt the shadows into each other. This increases that feeling of atmosphere that's so pleasant in paintings. And even if it doesn't look that way in the reference, we're not copying the reference, we're making a painting here. If there's areas that you feel like you want to lose an edge, or clarify an edge, or change a shape, take the liberty to do so. As I start to paint the platform she's standing on, I'm adding another sub-layer of value control here, where I want the platform fabric to feel slightly lighter than the dress fabric, but still darker than the skin. It may seem like quite the challenge to juggle all these different and very minute value ranges, and the secret here is a matter of training both your eye and your hand. You can achieve a completely rendered form with a value shift as small as 5%. As long as the shadows are in the correct place and the edges transitioning between the light and shadows are accurate, it's still going to feel like light on form. So if you're finding yourself struggling to separate the skin from the dress, try to really look and see if you're using too much contrast to render those individual materials. Something that can be really helpful is to create a palette for yourself on a different layer, where you select your highest value for the skin and your darkest value, then separate your highest value for the fabric from your darkest value, and only allow yourself to eyedrop from those swatches to paint their respective materials, rather than choosing your own values from the color picker. This can be an interesting challenge, as it will force you to make better decisions with your edges, rather than trying to push the rendering of form with more contrast. Here I'm making a slight adjustment to the dress, as I felt like the fabric wrapping around her calves needed to have a bit of a gradient towards a darker value as it got closer to the feet. This is a great opportunity to use some digital tricks, so I simply used the lasso tool to select that area of the cloth, then used a very large soft brush to paint just a little bit of shadow to get that nice gradient I was looking for. Now we're approaching the most daunting part of this particular reference, the complicated trim that wraps around the edges of her dress. There's a lot of different ways you could approach painting this, but this is one of my personal favorites. I like to start by creating a new layer specifically for that trim, This will make it a lot easier to manage and not have to worry about damaging my painting underneath. I'm going to start by just blocking in the major shapes of this trim, just trying to establish the large stripes that wrap around each area of this dress. I'm not worrying about adding any of the patterns or details, or even any of the lighting or shading. I'm just trying to create a clean selection on this new layer that I can then use to paint the trim on top of later. Once I've got a clean shape for my trim, I'm going to use the eraser tool to start cutting the pattern out of it. I want to use the eraser tool rather than painting dark values onto the trim, and you'll see why here in a minute. When it comes to patterns like this, it's important to think about how high fidelity your painting is supposed to be. Sometimes you'll need to get all of these patterns completely perfect. If that's your goal, there's better ways to do that than this, and I'll show some different techniques for that later on. In this case, my piece still has a bit of a painterly quality to it, so I don't need my patterns to be perfect. I'm not trying to copy the reference one for one, I'm simply looking at the reference, trying to understand the overall shape, language, and rhythms happening in this pattern, and then drawing my own nice stylized swirly shapes by erasing out of my layer with the eraser tool. This kind of work can feel really tedious, and you might be tempted to rush through it and just start scribbling halfway through, but if you really think about it, this doesn't take terribly long to do. Although I've time-lapsed it here, it only took me about 15 minutes to carve out all these small shapes in my pattern, which isn't that long overall. If you can be patient with yourself and take your time to really do these things right the first time, rather than rush through them and have to fix them later, not only will you save yourself time, but you'll also be more proud of the end result. Once I've finished erasing out the pattern from this new layer, I'm going to lock the transparency of the layer with the transparency checker box, and then simply use my soft brush to paint the lights and shadows on top of the pattern. Because I took the time to very cleanly establish these shapes with my brush tool and then the eraser tool, actually painting the light on this pattern becomes incredibly easy. All I have to do is choose the correct values and generally follow the lighting of the fabric underneath it. Once I've finished adding my highlights and shadows to the trim, I'm going to follow a very similar process for the subtle crown that she's wearing on her head. I'm going to create a new layer, roughly sketch in the shapes that I want to use for the crown, then locking the transparency of the layer, using a soft brush to establish the overall forms, and then I can go in with a hard brush to add highlights and establish the forms. After I'm done with the crown, I'm going to go back for my final pass on the portrait. I did take an entire day's break between the first half of this video and the second half, so coming back to the portrait, I'm seeing some issues that I want to correct and some forms that I want to improve. This is also a great time to zoom out and sort of scan over your whole painting for any shapes that look weird, any forms that you want to improve, or any edges that you want to soften to reinforce the focal point of your painting. If you take your time with each of these steps and try to really plan out your painting from start to finish, establish a clear and concise process, then even the most challenging of references can become quite simple. You simply have to be sure that you're setting yourself up for success and only tackling one problem at a time. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.